There are two things Eliza Calloway carried out of that house: a scuffed leather trunk and the knowledge that she would not die that winter. She was only certain about one of them. The August sun pressed down on the Dakota Territory like a brand held too long against skin. Heat shimmered up from the baked earth, invisible waves distorting the fence posts and the tree line into something liquid and uncertain. Eliza stood at the edge of the road in front of the only home she had ever known and did not cry. She counted, instead, 3 fence posts to the property line, 42 steps to the road, 2 miles roughly to the southern hills she had noticed 3 days ago while hauling water from the creek. Her mind worked that way, had always worked that way, assembling the world into measurements and distances and angles rather than feelings. Her mother had called it a gift. Her stepfather had called it unsettling in a girl. Roland Voss stood in the doorway. He did not come down the steps. He kept one hand on the doorframe as if the wood were holding him upright, and he spoke to the space between them rather than to her face directly. "You are not my blood," he said. "I cannot provide for you. Find your own way." The words were few and brittle, like dry kindling snapping underfoot. He had practiced them, she thought. There was a rehearsed quality to the flatness of his voice, as though he had been repeating them to himself for days, filing away the emotion until only the sentence remained. Margaret Calloway had been dead for 26 days. Her fever had come in the night and had not left, and when it finally took her, it took the only thing that had made their small cabin on the edge of Providence into something resembling a home. Without Margaret, Roland did not see a stepdaughter. He saw a reminder. Eliza picked up the trunk by its worn leather handle and turned toward the road. She almost did not look back. She had told herself she would not have made that small, private promise somewhere in the sleepless hours of the previous night. But at the last moment, something pulled at her, some instinct older than pride, and she turned her head. In the single upstairs window, half hidden behind the warped glass, stood Clara. Clara Voss was 8 years old and shared her father's dark eyes and her father's silence. But in this moment, her silence was of an entirely different kind. She had pressed one small hand flat against the glass, not waving, not quite, more like the gesture a person makes when they want to hold something in place that is already leaving. Her face was perfectly still, the way children's faces go still when they are trying very hard not to show what they understand. Eliza stopped walking. For 3 full seconds, she stood in the road with the trunk bumping against her leg and looked at that small hand on the glass, and something moved through her chest that had no name she could reach for quickly. It was not the grief of leaving. It was something sharper than that, more specific. Clara had not chosen any of this. Clara had stood in that window and watched and understood, and she had no words for it yet and no power to change it, and so she pressed her hand to the glass and held on. Eliza lifted 2 fingers in the briefest possible acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked. She did not look back again. But in the months that followed, on the coldest nights, when the wind found every seam in the world and tore at them, it would not be warmth she thought of first, or survival, or vindication. It would be that small hand on the glass and the weight of being seen by someone too young to pretend otherwise. The settlement of Providence watched her go with the particular expression frontier towns reserve for problems they have not yet decided how to categorize. She saw pity in some eyes and calculation in others, the rapid unconscious arithmetic of people determining whether her situation would require their resources before spring. No one offered a room. No one offered a meal. The cold calculus of survival allowed for sympathy, but rarely for inconvenience. And a 16-year-old girl alone with winter on the horizon was at best an inconvenience in waiting. Eliza was not looking for charity. She understood the calculus. She had grown up watching it operate. She was looking for information. The general store sat at the elbow where the main road bent toward the creek, a wide-fronted building with a porch that sagged slightly on one end and a sign that had lost 2 of its letters to weather. Agnes Prentice ran it alone, had run it alone since her husband died in 1871, and she ran it with the precision of someone who had learned that sentiment was a luxury that spoiled quickly in the Dakota climate. Eliza had always been a little afraid of Agnes Prentice. The woman had a way of looking at you that suggested she had already calculated your probable outcome and filed it accordingly. She was 60 years old, built close to the ground, and moved through her store with the efficiency of a person who had never once misplaced anything in their life. She stocked everything from flour to boot nails to laudanum, and she knew the properties and limitations of every item on her shelves with an exactness that bordered on the devotional. Eliza set her trunk down outside and pushed through the door. Agnes was behind the counter entering figures in a ledger with a stub of pencil. She did not look up immediately. She finished her entry, pressed the pencil into the ledger spine, and then raised her eyes to Eliza with an expression that contained, as far as Eliza could determine, absolutely nothing in the way of surprise. "I heard Roland put you out," Agnes said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Where are you headed?" "South Hills." Eliza kept her voice level. "I have a question about the soil composition there, the clay layer specifically, whether it holds structure under freeze and thaw cycles or whether it fractures." Agnes was quiet for a moment. She set down her pencil. "That is not the question most girls in your situation come in here asking." "I know what I am building," Eliza said. "I need to know if the material will cooperate." Something shifted in Agnes's expression, though it was subtle enough that Eliza might have imagined it. The older woman moved around the counter and went to the window that faced south, looking out for a moment at the hills visible in the middle distance, soft and bronze in the August heat. "South-facing clay around here runs sandy," Agnes said finally. "More silica than the north-facing slopes. Binds well when dry. Excellent compression strength." She paused. "But it fractures under the freeze-thaw cycle if you do not reinforce it properly. My husband built his first brick kiln from it. The walls cracked through the first winter." Another pause, longer this time. "He rebuilt it with a different mixture. He knew how to fix his mistakes." She turned back from the window and looked at Eliza directly. "He died before he could teach me all of it," she said. "But he taught me enough that I know when someone is about to make the same error he made." "I'm not building a brick kiln," Eliza said. "No." Agnes studied her for another moment. "You are building something considerably more ambitious and considerably more likely to kill you if you get the details wrong." She walked back behind the counter and picked up her pencil again. "The clay you want is not on the surface. It is underneath the sandy layer, perhaps 18 inches down. Denser, more elastic. Mix it with cut grass and it will hold a wall together through a Dakota winter." She opened her ledger. "That is what my husband would have told you." Eliza understood, without being told directly, that the conversation was over. "Thank you," she said. Agnes had already returned to her figures. "Do not thank me," she said without looking up. "I am telling you the properties of soil. What you do with that information is your own concern." Eliza picked up her trunk and left. She did not see Agnes set down the pencil a second time after she had gone, did not see the older woman open a small drawer behind the counter and remove a folded piece of paper. It was a list written in Agnes's precise and economical hand of names. Families that might need assistance before March. People whose resources she had quietly calculated to be insufficient for a winter of unusual severity. She unfolded it, smoothed it on the counter, and wrote at the bottom in her small, careful script, "Eliza Calloway, South Hills." Then she folded it and put it back in the drawer. She did not do this with malice. She did it the way she did everything, which was to say, practically and without sentiment. She had seen too many confident people die to believe that determination was the same as survival. She would be wrong about Eliza Calloway, but she did not know that yet. 2 miles south of Providence, the prairie buckled and rolled into a series of low hills, and one of them stopped Eliza in her tracks. It faced due south. The slope was steep but stable, covered in a thick mat of buffalo grass, whose roots she could see along an exposed section of bank tangled into a dense dark web that had been growing and reinforcing itself for longer than any person currently living in Providence had been alive. At the base of the hill, curving around its southern foot, a small, clear stream moved quietly over flat stones. The water was cold and clean. She could hear it from 20 feet away. She put down the trunk and stood very still for a long moment, looking at the hill the way her grandfather had taught her through the pages of his journal, and through her mother's voice reading those pages aloud on winter evenings, to read a thing before you read it. She was looking for what the hill was, not just what it appeared to be. She opened the journal. Thomas Calloway had been a collier in the coal mines of South Wales for 30 years, before a fever and a failed crop and a neighbor's letter about American prospects had convinced him to bring his family across the ocean in 1855. He had worked the mines at Merthyr Tydfil, where the earth was dark and damp, and the men who worked it learned very quickly that the ground was not hostile, but inhabited, alive in its slow geological way, breathing in thermal cycles that had nothing to do with the seasons above. He had written his journal not as a technical manual, but as a series of letters to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone who might come after, in a handwriting that was small and angular and occasionally broke into Welsh when the English words did not carry the weight he needed. Eliza had grown up hearing her mother read from it. Margaret had not understood all of it had said so freely, but she had loved the sound of her father's voice in the sentences and had read them to Eliza the way other mothers read nursery rhymes with a rhythm that had lodged itself permanently in Eliza's memory before she was old enough to parse the meaning. Now she read it alone, and the absence of her mother's voice in the words was a specific, located pain, the way a missing tooth leaves a shape in the jaw that the tongue returns to involuntarily. The principal Thomas had called the gwal, a Welsh word that meant wall or bed, or in his expanded usage, the primary shelter of the earth itself, occupied the final third of the journal. He had drawn diagrams with the careful precision of a man accustomed to working in conditions where an error in measurement could bring a ceiling down on 20 men. A rectangular chamber cut into a south-facing hillside, walls of compressed sod brick 2 feet thick, a roof of timber lattice covered with earth and grass until the living roots sealed it from above, and the chimney, which was not a chimney in any conventional sense, but a horizontal tunnel 40 feet long, lined with mortared creek stone, running from the stove at the interior of the dwelling out and away through the earth to a small opening at the surface well beyond the entrance. The principle was this. Beneath the frost line, the earth maintains a temperature of roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, regardless of the season above. It stores the long heat of summer in its thermal mass, the way a stone fireplace stores the heat of a single fire, releasing it slowly over months. A dwelling built into the hillside rather than upon it is insulated on 3 sides and above by hundreds of tons of earth, creating an environment that requires almost no additional heat to remain survivable. The horizontal flue is the active element of the system. Hot exhaust gases from the stove travel through the stone channel and surrender their heat to the surrounding earth before exiting at the surface. Instead of warmth bleeding up a chimney into the sky above the roof, it bleeds into the thermal battery of the hill itself. A small fire steadily maintained is sufficient to keep the system charged. A roaring fire, the kind that devours a woodpile, is unnecessary. Thomas had written at the bottom of the diagram in both English and Welsh, "Pay the rent before you leave." Eliza looked from the journal to the hill and back again. The mathematics were not complicated. The principle was not exotic. It was simply old, and old things in a new country had a way of being mistaken for the ideas of a disturbed mind. She sold the silver bracelet at the hardware store in Providence the following morning. It had been her mother's, a thin band with a small engraved flower, the kind of object that carries its value in ways that have nothing to do with price. The hardware man gave her enough for a spade and a pickaxe and a length of rope, and she did not let herself look at the bracelet again after she laid it on the counter. The work began on a Tuesday. The prairie sod was not soil in any simple sense. It was a living structure 2 feet deep, in places woven through with the roots of 100 varieties of grass that had been growing and dying and growing again on the same ground for 10,000 years. It had the density of something deliberately engineered, which in a way it was engineered by wind and rain and the slow pressure of seasons into something that resisted intrusion with quiet ferocity. Eliza learned its resistance intimately over the following days. Her hands, which had been soft in the way that domestic life makes hands soft, transformed in stages she could track precisely. The blisters came first, then the tearing, then the bleeding that left rust-colored stains on the handle of the spade. She packed the cuts with clay in the evenings and kept working through the sting. Within a week, the soft skin was gone, replaced by something tighter and more functional, and the pain had reduced itself from sharp to dull to simply present the way weather is present, a condition of the environment rather than an event within it. She cut the sod into large rectangular bricks, stacking them carefully to one side. They would be her walls. The earth beneath the sod was dense clay, darker and more cohesive than the sandy surface layer Agnes had described. Exactly where Agnes had said to look 18 inches down, she found it. She allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction at that. People from Providence rode past. Some stopped. They saw a girl covered in dirt digging a hole in the side of a hill with a determination that struck most of them as symptomatic of something. The consensus that formed over the following week, passed from porch to porch and across the counter at Agnes Prentice's store, was that the Calloway girl had been broken by grief and was now engaged in the construction of her own grave. They called it Eliza's folly, with the gentle contempt that communities reserve for things they do not need to take seriously. It traveled through Providence on whispers and small laughs, the comfortable laughter of people watching someone else make a mistake. On the ninth day, Eliza's pickaxe struck something that rang differently than the dense clay she had been working through, a flat, resonant sound that moved up the handle and into her palms like a note struck on an instrument. She cleared the surface with her hands and found a layer of stone, flat and wide and dark gray, the kind of dense, fine-grained rock that splits along clean plains and lies in the earth like pages stacked in a book. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. It was perfect flagstone, enough of it she suspected to pave an entire floor and line the horizontal flue from end to end. The hill had been waiting with it for longer than Providence had existed, longer than the territory had a name sitting there beneath the grass in precisely the configuration she needed. For the first time since her mother died, Eliza Calloway laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was not the kind of laugh that carries relief in it or triumph. It was the small, surprised laugh of a person who has just been answered by something they were not sure was listening. The evenings were harder than the days. During the day, there was always work to be done, always the next specific task to calculate and execute, and the specificity kept the larger fears at a manageable distance. But in the evenings, when the light dropped and the temperature fell, and she sat with the journal open on her knees and the first stars appearing above the unfinished mouth of her excavation, the fears came in more directly. It was not the cold she was afraid of. Not exactly. The fear she could not fully suppress in those quiet hours was something more fundamental. Her grandfather had loved the earth so completely that he had never stopped going underground, even when the mines became dangerous, even when the shoring timbers cracked and the foreman started requiring two men to enter certain tunnels instead of one. He had loved it too well, perhaps. And a tunnel had killed him in 1861, caved in during a wet spring when the clay had loosened around the support beams, and he was 43 years old and had never met his granddaughter and never would. The question that came to her in the dark was this: what if his love of the earth had made him see what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there? What if the certainty in the diagrams was the certainty of a man who had decided on an answer and then drawn the evidence to match it? She sat with this for a long time on a particular evening in early September, not reading, just looking at the handwriting. It was a specific kind of handwriting, cramped and forward-leaning, the writing of someone who wrote quickly because the thought was moving faster than the hand could follow. In the margins of several pages, he had sketched small things with no obvious technical purpose. A bird, the profile of a hill that looked like a sleeping man, a flower she did not recognize. And then in the lower right corner of nearly every page, a small mark. Not a word, just a shape, two curves crossing, a letter formed within a simple outline. The letter E inscribed in a heart no larger than a thumbnail. She turned pages slowly, checking. It was on every page from roughly the middle of the journal to the end. He had done it so consistently that it could not have been absent-minded. It was deliberate. It was intentional. It was for someone. Her mother's name was Margaret. There was no one in the family she knew of whose name began with E, not in Wales, not in America, except Eliza, who had been born 6 years after Thomas Calloway died. She understood that this was perhaps not the explanation. The mark might have been a Welsh symbol, a shorthand for something technical, the initial of a friend or a lost child, or a word in a language she did not fully read. She had no way to know. The journal did not explain it. The journal simply carried it, page after page, this small, repeated gesture towards something or someone that Thomas had kept private even in his most private writing. Eliza looked at the mark on the current page for a long time. Then she closed the journal and stood up and went back to the excavation, and she did not stop for the rest of the night until the stars were fading and the eastern sky had begun to show its first gray suggestion of morning. She could not explain what had changed, only that it had. A week after that, Daniel Marsh appeared. He came from the north on a bay horse checking his trap line, and he would have ridden past without stopping, except that he was constitutionally incapable of passing something unusual without investigating it. He was 19 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of outdoor work, with his mother's light eyes, and a habit of chewing on the inside of his cheek when he was thinking that he had never quite managed to break. His surname was different from his stepfather's because his mother had kept his biological father's name when she remarried, and Edmund Hartwell had accepted this without comment, which was characteristic of Edmund, who expressed his feelings primarily through silence and structural integrity. Daniel pulled up short when he saw the excavation, the neat stacks of sod brick, the growing mound of displaced earth, and the girl at the center of it covered in clay up to her elbows. "What are you building?" he asked. Eliza straightened and looked at him without particular concern. "A house?" He looked at the hillside, at the rectangular cut she had made in its face at the depth of the chamber she had already achieved. "In the ground. My grandfather was a coal miner. He spent 30 years underground and never died of cold once." Daniel was quiet for a moment, working through this. Then, because he had no immediate answer, and the logic seemed to require some response he had not yet formulated, he nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and rode on. That evening, sitting across from his stepfather at supper, he described what he had seen. Edmund Hartwell listened without interrupting, which was his way. When Daniel finished, Edmund set down his fork with a deliberateness that meant he was choosing his words. "Stay away from there," Edmund said. Daniel did not argue. He knew better than to argue with Edmund when Edmund used that particular register of quiet. But he went to sleep that night thinking about the logic of the thing, about the mathematics of mass and insulation drawing shapes in the dark behind his closed eyes that he could not quite resolve into a conclusion. The following week, on his next run of the trap line, he stopped his horse at the edge of the hill and sat watching Eliza work for a moment. Then he tied the horse to a cottonwood branch, walked to the stream, filled a pail with water, and retrieved the half loaf of bread he had wrapped in cloth that morning, with no particular reason he had allowed himself to examine too closely. He carried both to the edge of the excavation and set them down without speaking. Then he walked back to his horse and rode away. Eliza looked at the pail and the bread for a moment. She had not eaten since morning. She picked up the bread and ate it without sitting down, and used the water to mix a batch of clay mortar. And the mortar she mixed that afternoon held better than any she had made before, and she did not think too carefully about whether the quality of the water or the quality of her concentration was responsible for the difference. It was on a Thursday in late September that Edmund Hartwell came to the hill. He came alone, which was how Edmund preferred to do things that he considered serious without an audience. He dismounted with the careful economy of a large man who has learned to move precisely, and he stood at the edge of Eliza's excavation and surveyed what she had accomplished with an expression that moved through several registers before settling on something that looked from a distance like professional offense. The chamber was already 8 feet deep at the back wall, sloping up to 7 feet at the entrance. The sod brick walls of the front face were rising in careful courses, each brick offset from the one below it, the seams staggered like masonry work. She had framed the entrance with timbers from a cottonwood that lightning had brought down along the creek. The floor was laid with the flagstones she had found flat and level, fitted together without mortar, because the fit was tight enough to need none. Edmund looked at all of this for a long time without speaking. "Child," he said finally. His voice was low and carried the particular authority of a man who had spent 30 years building things that stood up. "What do you think you are doing?" Eliza kept working. "Building my home, Mr. Hartwell." He made a sound that was more breath than language. "This is a root cellar, a den for a fox." He moved around the edge of the excavation, looking at the walls from different angles, the way he assessed work that had been brought to him for evaluation. "The damp will get into your bones. The frost will heave the walls. It will collapse on you in your sleep." "The earth is warmer than the air," Eliza said. "At depth. That is a fool's notion." She stopped and looked at him directly for the first time. "It's that your own root cellar stays above freezing all winter. Why do you think that is, Mr. Hartwell?" He was not accustomed to being questioned on structural matters, and certainly not by girls, and the specific quality of his silence in that moment was like the silence before a weather event, charged and briefly still. "A proper log home," he said, "with a sound stone fireplace. That is how a man survives a Dakota winter. You have no foundation. You have no real chimney. You will die in this hole." Eliza held his gaze. Something in her had settled during the weeks of work, some internal architecture that the digging had built alongside the external one. She was tired and her hands hurt, and she had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since she had come to this hill, but she was not rattled by Edmund Hartwell or by the certainty he wore like a second coat. "My walls will be 2 feet of sod and 50 feet of earth," she said quietly. "Yours are 8 inches of wood. I think I will be warmer." The flush that came to Edmund's face was the flush of a man who has been challenged in the one domain where he considers himself beyond challenge, and it was rapid and deep, and it made him look briefly like someone she had not seen before. He was not a cruel man in any simple sense, but he had built his identity on a particular kind of competence, and competence that is treated as an identity becomes fragile in ways that simple confidence never is. "When the first blizzard hits," he said, his voice gone flat and hard, "and you are freezing in this mud hole, Do not expect the people of Providence to risk their lives coming out here to save you. You are making your choice. You will lie in the grave you are so busy digging." He turned, swung himself onto his horse, and rode north without looking back. Eliza watched him go. She did not feel the satisfaction of a point scored. What she felt was something quieter and less comfortable, the recognition that he believed every word he had said, that his certainty was as complete and genuine as a structural beam, and that nothing she had said had moved it by a fraction. She picked up her spade. That evening, sitting in the mouth of the excavation with the journal open across her knees and the last of the daylight going purple over the hills, she turned to the page with Thomas Calloway's diagram of the horizontal flue and read the note at the bottom again. "The fire is a noisy guest, but the heat is a loyal friend. Learn which one to invite into your walls." She had read this sentence more times than she could count. But this evening, with Edmund Hartwell's voice still present in her memory, and the small ache of his contempt still findable in her chest, she read it differently. She read it not as instruction, but as a kind of company. The voice of a man who had understood something that the people around him had not, who had written it down in a cramped, urgent hand and sent it forward through time in a leather-wrapped journal, trusting that it would find whoever needed it. He had not known her name. He had not known she would exist. But in the lower right corner of the page, just below the last line of the diagram, the small mark was there, as it was on every page, the letter E inscribed in its careful little frame. Eliza closed the journal. The following morning, she began digging the horizontal flue, and from across the distance that separated Providence from the South Hills, the new direction of her excavation, parallel to the earth rather than vertical, looked to every passing eye like the final definitive evidence that grief had finished whatever reason had started. Edmund Hartwell heard about it that afternoon and felt for the first time since he had ridden away from that hill completely certain he had been right. By the middle of October, two things were true simultaneously in the Dakota Territory. In Providence, Edmund Hartwell was finishing the last of his autumn chinking with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done something correctly for the 30th consecutive year. 2 miles south, Eliza Calloway was burying her chimney, and the entire settlement had decided with the comfortable unanimity of people who do not need to examine their assumptions that she had lost her mind completely. What no one in Providence understood, because understanding it would have required standing still long enough to think, rather than simply react, was that these two activities were not comparable at all. Edmund was completing something. Eliza was inventing something. Those are different kinds of work, and they require different kinds of courage, and only one of them had any chance of surviving what was coming. The horizontal flue took 11 days to build. Eliza gathered the stone from the creek bed in loads, carrying it up the slope in her arms, and in a canvas sack she had traded for at Providence's dry goods counter with the last of the coins she had kept folded in her boot. The creek stone was ideal because water had already done the work of finding its weaknesses, had already cracked away the fragments that would have failed under pressure, leaving behind the dense and trustworthy. She learned to select by sound, tapping each stone with the pickaxe handle before she carried it, listening for the solid note that meant internal integrity, rather than the dull, hollow sound that meant fracture waiting to happen. Her grandfather had written about this in the journal, not as instruction, but as observation in a passage about a young miner who had not yet learned to listen and had trusted a ceiling beam that sounded wrong and had spent 3 weeks in the company doctor's care as a result. Thomas Calloway had believed deeply in the intelligence available to the senses if a person bothered to develop them, and Eliza had been developing hers for 11 days on the face of a Dakota hillside, and by the time she was selecting stone for the flue channel, she could distinguish 4 distinct grades of creek stone by sound alone. She mortared the channel with the clay mixture she had refined over the previous weeks, working it to a consistency that her hands now recognized without measuring. She built the channel walls 2 stones thick, capped it with the flat flagstones she had found earlier, and buried the entire structure under 8 inches of packed earth before beginning the next section. It was during the 3rd day of this work that Agnes Prentice came to the hill. She arrived without announcement on foot, which was unusual for Agnes, who generally conserved her energy with the same deliberateness she applied to her finances. She stood at the edge of the construction for a long time without speaking, watching Eliza work with the focused attention of someone running a calculation rather than making a social call. Eliza kept working. She had learned through the accumulation of small observations over a lifetime that Agnes Prentice operated on her own schedule, and that attempting to accelerate that schedule produced nothing useful. Finally, Agnes said, "The diameter is wrong." Eliza stopped. "My husband built his first brick kiln with a draw channel narrower than that," Agnes said. She was looking at the channel, opening her expression, the precise and unsentimental expression of someone identifying a structural problem rather than offering an opinion. Creosote built up along the stone surfaces within 3 weeks. The channel blocked. The kiln ran cold. She paused. When he rebuilt it, he used 8 inches minimum interior diameter. Said anything narrower and the channel fights itself. The hot gases cannot move freely enough to deposit their heat before they slow down and cool into a solid obstruction. She looked at the channel Eliza had built. It was 6 inches interior diameter. "He learned that lesson once," Agnes said. "He did not learn it twice because he was thorough enough to understand it the first time." A pause that contained something Eliza could not quite categorize. "I am telling you what he would have told you if he were here to tell you." She turned and walked back down the hill. Eliza looked at the channel she had spent 3 days building. She sat with the information for a few minutes, running the implication in both directions. Agnes was right. She knew Agnes was right before she had finished hearing the explanation, the way you sometimes know an answer before you have consciously worked through the problem, because the answer fits the shape of everything else you already know. She picked up the pickaxe and began dismantling what she had built. It took 3 days to rebuild the channel at the correct diameter. 3 days of work done twice, which in the arithmetic of a person racing a Dakota winner was a cost of considerable weight. She did not feel sorry for herself about it. She felt, if anything, a cold and clarifying respect for the difficulty of the thing she was attempting. The journal made it look certain. The journal was the record of someone who had worked out the errors before committing them to paper. The actual building of the thing was a different document entirely written in the material itself, and the material was less patient than ink. What Eliza did not see, because she was looking at her rebuilt channel rather than at the road to Providence, was Agnes Prentice that same evening removing the folded paper from her desk drawer, opening it and drawing a clean line through the name she had written at the bottom. Not because Agnes had become confident that Eliza would survive, but because the girl had been shown where she was wrong and had immediately begun correcting the error rather than defending it. In Agnes's long experience of human beings in difficult conditions, that single quality separated the people who lived from the people who did not more reliably than strength or resources or any other factor she had ever observed. She folded the paper and put it back. The dwelling was completed in the first week of October. Eliza had framed the entrance with the cottonwood timber, laid her floor of fitted flagstone, built the front wall of sod brick to a height of 7 feet with an opening for the door and a smaller opening for a window that she covered with greased hide stretched on a cottonwood frame. The roof was a lattice of smaller branches topped with dried grass and a final layer of sod bricks laid root side up so that in the spring the grass would reknit and the roof would become part of the living hillside, indistinguishable from the ground above it. She installed the small cast iron stove in the front corner, connecting its pipe to the mouth of the rebuilt stone channel. The interior was cool and dim and smelled of damp earth and cut grass, the smell of something that had been waiting underground for a long time and was now awake. On the afternoon she finished, Eliza built the first fire. She used a small amount of wood-dry cottonwood branches no thicker than her wrist, the kind of fire she would use on an ordinary evening through the winter. She waited until the stove was running steadily, then went outside, walked the 40 feet to the channel's exit opening, and crouched down with her palm over the stone-lined hole in the earth. She waited. 15 minutes passed. The surface temperature had dropped to perhaps 35 degrees as the afternoon aged, and her bare hand over the opening felt nothing but cold air. She did not move. The fire in the stove was small and the channel was long, and the stone had been cold for weeks. At 20 minutes, something changed. It was not heat in any dramatic sense. It was the absence of cold specifically locally against her palm. A faint pressure of warmth, no more than the temperature of a breath, held briefly in cupped hands rising from the stone channel below. She did not stand up immediately. She kept her hand there for a long moment, feeling the warmth build with a slowness that was itself the point, the slowness being the proof rather than a deficiency, the evidence that the heat was being absorbed and held rather than simply passing through. When she finally stood, she did not speak. There was no one to speak to. The hills ran south and west into a country that had no interest in what she had just accomplished, and the sky above was the particular pale blue of a late October afternoon that knows what it is about to become. She sat down on the ground and cried, not from relief, not from triumph. The emotion that came was simpler and more specific than either of those, and it was this: her mother had read the passage about the horizontal flu 5 times before Eliza had understood it, reading slowly with her finger under each word, pausing at the diagram so that Eliza could study the angles and the proportions and the small notation that said pay the rent. And Margaret would never know that the flu worked. She would never know that the warmth was real. She would never know that the strange cramped journal of her dead father, which she had carried across half a continent and read aloud to a child by firelight as though it were fairy tales, had told the truth all along. The warmth from the earth was rising against Eliza's palm, and her mother was not anywhere in the world to feel it. She cried until the cold made crying impractical. Then she got up, went inside, and added 2 more pieces of wood to the fire. That night, reading by the small kerosene lamp she had traded for at the Providence hardware store, she turned to the final page of the journal. Below the sentence about fire and heat, which she had read 1,000 times, she noticed for the first time what she had somehow missed before. Tucked into the back cover, folded 4 times into a square no larger than her thumb, was a piece of paper she had never seen. She unfolded it carefully because the paper was old and the fold lines were deep. It was a drawing, not a diagram, not a technical sketch, but a drawing done by hand and pencil, imprecise, and clearly not the work of a draftsman. A hillside rendered in the loose, confident lines of someone who was recording something he could see in his mind rather than on paper. A small door in the face of the hill. From the door, or perhaps from a point near it, a thin wisp of something that could only be smoke. Below the drawing in Welsh, 2 words that she had to work through slowly, because her Welsh was imperfect and uncertain: Dinar Cartref. This is the home. Thomas Calloway had drawn this house before she was born. He had folded the drawing and kept it in the back of the journal that he had packed when he left Wales for America, the journal he had continued writing in until whatever date preceded his death in 1861. He had drawn a house that his granddaughter would build in Dakota Territory in 1883, before there was a Dakota Territory, before there was an Eliza. She sat with that for a long time. What it meant was not simple. He had imagined this house but had never built it, which meant either that the conditions had never been right, or that he had run out of time, or that he had intended it as a thing for the future rather than the present. He had carried the dream of it from Wales to Pennsylvania to wherever the Calloway family had finally tried to take root, and then he had died, and the dream had folded itself into the back of the journal and waited. She had not learned from her grandfather. She had finished something he had started and could not complete. That was a different kind of inheritance, entirely heavier and more specific than instruction, and it settled on her in the lamplight with a weight that was not burden but responsibility, which is a kind of weight you choose to carry. It was Daniel who came first to see what she had built. He arrived on a gray afternoon in early November, the sky the color of pewter, and the wind beginning to carry the first real threat of what was coming. He tied his horse at the cottonwood and walked to the door, and Eliza opened it before he knocked, having heard his footsteps on the stone she had laid outside the entrance. He stepped in, stopped, stood in the middle of the room, and was quiet for long enough that Eliza, who had grown accustomed to quiet, found herself waiting for whatever he was going to say with more attention than she expected. He was not touching the walls. He was not making the calculations that she could see people make when they were assessing a space, the rapid, unconscious measurement of dimensions and surfaces. He was just standing still, and his expression was one she did not immediately have a word for. "It is quiet," he said finally. "Yes, I did not think it would be quiet." He looked toward the roof, then at the front wall, then at the small stove producing its modest heat. "Outside there is wind. I cannot hear it." "The earth does not conduct sound the same way air does," Eliza said. "The walls are not vibrating." Daniel was silent for a moment longer. Then he took his satchel from his shoulder and opened it and withdrew a notebook, and inside the notebook were pages of pencil drawings that he laid on the table between them. Eliza looked at the drawings. They were his reconstructions of what he had seen and what she had told him during his 2 brief previous visits, assembled from memory and inference into diagrams that were not as precise as Thomas's, but demonstrated a structural logic that was independent and sound. He had gotten most of it right. The angle of the entry slope, the relationship between the stove position and the channel mouth, the depth of the front wall, and its connection to the hillside mass behind it. He had made two errors, both in areas where he had been guessing rather than observing, and both of the errors were in the direction of overbuilding rather than underbuilding, which told her something about his instincts. She pointed to the first error and explained it in two sentences, then the second. Daniel looked at the corrections, made 2 marks in the margins, and nodded. "You drew this from memory," Eliza said. "After my second visit," he paused. "I needed to understand it, for myself." Why? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the diagrams rather than at her. "Because when I could not explain why it was right, I could feel that it was. And I have learned that when those two things disagree, the feeling is usually closer to correct than the explanation." He looked up. "My father taught me that about wood, about how a good joint feels before you can measure it." He said nothing else for a moment. Then, "I am going to tell my father what I have seen, not to convince him. He will not be convinced by a description, but he deserves to hear the truth from me before the winter tells it to him in a way I cannot control." He said it without drama, as a simple statement of intention. Eliza looked at him for a moment, reading the quality of the decision in his face, the particular look of someone who has accepted the cost of something before agreeing to pay it. "He will not receive it well," she said. "I know." He picked up his notebook and put it back in the satchel. "That is not the same as him not deserving to hear it," he told Edmund that evening. Edmund Hartwell listened to his stepson describe the interior of the dugout, the temperature, the quiet, the walls, and the small, steady fire producing heat disproportionate to its size. And he listened with the expression of a man who is hearing something he has already decided is incorrect and is waiting for the specific error that will allow him to say so. When Daniel finished, Edmund stood up from the table and walked to his workbench at the back of the house, and he stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the surface and his back to his stepson. "Your stepfather said he is going to Providence," he said, finally, using the third person for himself the way he sometimes did when making pronouncements he was treating as formal rather than personal. Then he seemed to realize what he had said and corrected it. "I said I was going to Providence, and I am going. There is work to do before the weather turns." He did not turn around. Daniel stood in the kitchen looking at his stepfather's back and understood something he had suspected for a long time, but had never seen confirmed so clearly. Edmund was not angry because Eliza might be wrong. He was not even angry because Daniel had been visiting the hill after being told not to. He was standing with his back turned and his hands flat on the workbench because the thing Daniel had described, a house warm with a small firewalls that did not leak cold, the complete absence of the draft that tormented every log dwelling in the territory during a blizzard, was what Edmund had been trying to build for 30 years. It was what he had believed was impossible, not because he had tested the possibility, but because no one had shown him otherwise. And the architecture of a man's expertise is built on the things he has never been shown as much as the things he has. "I know you have work to do," Daniel said quietly. "I thought you should know. That is all." He went to bed. Edmund stayed at the workbench for a long time in the lamplight, his hands flat on the wood, and the expression on his face was one his family had never seen before. November came in hard. The first real blizzard announced itself 3 days in advance to anyone who knew how to read the sky. Eliza had been watching for it. She had spent the preceding 2 weeks laying in supplies. She had traded labor at the Providence grain store for a quantity of dried corn and jerked venison and a 20-pound bag of flour, carrying each load back to the hill in stages because she could not afford a cart, and the trunk served as a drag sled over the still dry ground. She had a modest wood pile, stacked under an overhang she had cut into the hillside's north face, protected from wind and moisture, and she had counted it more than once and calculated its duration against various winter scenarios, including scenarios she hoped would not occur. She also had the notebook where she had been tracking the stove's consumption since the first fire. The numbers were better than she had planned for. On a cold night requiring continuous heat, she was burning less than a third of what Thomas's journal had estimated as necessary for a conventional wood stove. The system was holding. Her warmest interior temperature to date on an exterior day of 12 degrees Fahrenheit had been 61 degrees Celsius. The fire producing it had been the size of a man's head. She did not permit herself to feel secure. Security was a specific kind of attention failure, and the Dakota winter had not yet shown its full intention. The first blizzard lasted 4 days. Inside the hill, Eliza heard it the way you hear something happening in another room of a large house present, but attenuated, the roar reduced to a low sustained pressure against the sod roof. the occasional creak of the cottonwood frame flexing but holding. The temperature inside dropped 3 degrees over the 4-day period, which was the thermal mass responding to the absence of solar input through the earth above. She ran 2 small fires per day rather than one, and the temperature stabilized. She read, she mended. She worked through the later sections of the journal that she had never fully understood before finding that the material world now available to her senses made legible things that had been abstract when she was reading by lamplight in a borrowed room. On the 3rd day, she heard something above the muffled roar of the wind, a sound at the door, not loud, a scuffing irregular, the sound of something working against the drift that had built against the entrance. She opened the door. Daniel stood in the opening, covered in snow to the shoulder, his face a dark red from the cold, a canvas pack across his back. He had to push against the drift to get inside, and when she pulled the door shut behind him, the sudden silence of the interior made his breathing seem very loud. He stood dripping onto her stone floor for a moment, collecting himself. "I needed to know," he said simply, "whether it was still working in a real storm." "It is 60 degrees in here," Eliza said. He pulled off his outer coat. The cold was in his skin, visible in the color of his hands, but he was not in any danger. He stood in the center of the room and looked around as he had before, and this time what she saw in his face was not curiosity, but something more complicated, something with a particular quality that she associated with the experience of being shown that a thing you have been told cannot work has been working all along. He sat down at the table, opened his notebook, and for the next 2 hours in the warm quiet of a dwelling that had no business being warm or quiet during a Dakota blizzard, Daniel Marsh asked every question he had been carrying for the past 2 months, and Eliza answered each one in the order it arrived, and the room was heated by a fire the size of a man's head, and the walls did not creak, and outside the wind continued its long assault on a landscape that could not hear it. Before he left, standing at the door with his coat back on, he said, "I am going to tell my father again. Not the description this time. I am going to tell him what I know." "He will not receive it differently than before," Eliza said. "Probably not." He looked at the packed drift just beyond the door, the white wall of moving air beyond it. "But there is a difference between telling a man something he does not want to hear and telling a man something he needs to hear. My father has earned the second kind." He pushed out into the storm, and Eliza watched the drift close behind him, the way water closes behind a hand withdrawn from a pool. December came, and then a January, that the old-timers would spend the next 50 years locating in their stories by temperature alone, because there was no other reference point sufficient to anchor it. The cold arrived not as a weather event, but as a geological fact, a condition of the landscape as permanent and indifferent as the stone beneath the soil, a cold that the thermometers could not fully measure because the instruments themselves began to fail. The mercury froze in the glass tubes at 38 below. People switched to spirit thermometers, which ran lower, and those stopped at 44 below one evening in the second week of January, and no one could say with certainty what the temperature was after that because no one had an instrument that could tell them. In Providence, the winter had moved from inconvenience to emergency without pausing to be anything in between. Wood piles that had seemed excessive in October were half gone by the new year and vanishing at rates that no one had planned for. The problem was not simply the cold, but the wind that arrived with it, a sustained northwesterly that found every gap in every structure and converted each gap into a continuous draft that stole heat faster than any fire could produce it. Edmund Hartwell's fireplace burned hot and constant and consumed wood at a rate that he tracked with the same sick attention a man gives a wound that is not closing. His wife kept the children near the fire. The youngest had developed a cough in November that had become something more persistent through December, and had now acquired a quality that made Edmund pause every time he heard it, something dry and urgent in its rhythm that he could not dismiss as winter cold. He went through the calculations again. He did not need paper. He had been running them continuously for 3 weeks. The remaining wood against the probable remaining winter, the variables he could not control, the gap between what he had and what he would need. The gap was not closable. He sat at the table on the evening of January 14th and looked at the fireplace he had built with his own hands 12 years ago. The fireplace that had always been sufficient, that had always been more than adequate for any winter. He had known, and for the first time in his adult life, he understood that the past was not a reliable guarantee of the future, and that a life built on accumulated expertise could arrive without warning at the edge of a problem that the expertise could not solve. He sat for a long time. Daniel came in from checking the livestock, knocking snow from his coat at the door. He looked at his stepfather's face and then looked away. And in that brief look, there passed between them a kind of communication that required no language, because they were both men who had spent their lives working with materials and measuring what was necessary and what was not, and they both knew what the face of a man who has run the numbers and does not like the answer looks like. "I am going to Providence," Edmund said. "The storm is starting again," Daniel said. "You can hear it." "I know." He stood up and went to the coat rack. He pulled on his heaviest coat, the one he wore only when there was no choice about going outside, the one that had cost him a month's work in trade, and which he had maintained for 11 years with the same care he gave his best tools. Daniel watched him. "Father," he said. The word came out with a weight he rarely gave it, carrying in its single syllable everything they did not usually say to each other. Edmund put on his hat. He wound the muffler twice around his face, leaving only his eyes. He did not tell Daniel where he was going because Daniel already knew, and saying it would have required Edmund to form a sentence that he was not yet capable of forming. He opened the door and the wind came in like something that had been waiting, and he went out into it and the door swung shut behind him. Outside, 2 miles south, inside a hill that the residents of Providence had spent 3 months calling a folly, in a grave a small fire burned in a cast-iron stove and the walls exhaled a warmth that had been accumulating since August. And the temperature was 60 degrees, and Eliza Calloway was reading by lamplight and listening to the storm with the specific quality of attention you give a noise that cannot reach you. She did not yet know that Edmund Hartwell was moving through it toward her door. But 40 feet from that door, rising from a stone-lined opening in the snow, a thin, lazy wisp of vapor climbed into the frozen air and was taken immediately by the wind and gone. And if you had known what you were looking at, you would have known that something down there was breathing. Edmund Hartwell had built 41 structures in his life. He had built them from pine and oak and cottonwood and riverstone, had built them in summer heat. In autumn rain had built them for families who had nothing and for men who had considerable resources and wanted their wealth made visible in the permanence of what they owned. He had built a church, 2 grain stores, a schoolhouse, and more cabins than he could count, without the ledger he kept in the top drawer of his workbench. Every one of those structures was still standing. Not one of them had failed. He thought about this as he moved through the storm, leaning into the wind with his head down and his muffler packed hard against his face, because thinking about his work was the only discipline he had that was stronger than the particular kind of fear he was feeling, which was not the fear of the cold. Though the cold was serious, but the deeper and more disorienting fear of a man who has based his entire sense of himself on a competence that may be insufficient. He had told the girl she would die in that hole. He had said it with the full weight of his experience and his reputation and his 30 years of understanding how structures behaved in cold weather. And he had said it publicly in the hearing of people whose opinion he valued, and he had said it without hesitation, because he had not hesitated. He had been as certain as he had ever been about anything. He found moving through the blizzard with ice forming on his muffler, where his breath condensed and froze, that certainty, in retrospect, had an entirely different quality than certainty in the moment. In the moment, it had felt like knowledge. From where he stood now, in the dark, in the cold, moving toward the house he had condemned, it felt like something he did not have a better word for than arrogance, and the word sat badly in his chest. He almost missed the hill entirely. The storm had reduced the visible world to a radius of perhaps 8 feet in any direction, beyond which everything dissolved into moving white. He was navigating by the creek sound on his left and the slight upward grade of the ground beneath his feet, and twice he had to stop and recalibrate because the wind pushed him sideways, and the creek sound moved in a way that did not correspond to his expectation. He fell once into a drift that came up to his hip, and getting out of it cost him more than he expected, and he lay on the surface for a moment afterward, breathing hard, with the cold pressing down through his coat towards something vital. He thought about his youngest child coughing in the firelight. He got up. He found the hill not by seeing it, but by the change in the wind. When he moved into the lee of its mass, a sudden reduction in the direct force of the storm that told him something large and solid was behind him and to his right. He turned into it and moved along its base until his boot hit stone, the flat stones Eliza had laid in front of her entrance, and then he looked up and saw what he had come to find. Not a door, not a light, not any of the conventional signs of habitation that he would have been looking for. A wisp of vapor rising from a small stone-lined opening in the snow, perhaps 4 feet above the grade, thin as a breath, pale as milk, climbing maybe 3 feet before the wind took it and erased it. It was the most unimpressive chimney he had ever seen in his life. It was the laziest, most diffident declaration of a fire's existence he could have imagined. A real chimney, a proper chimney, would have been throwing a column of smoke 20 feet into the air and losing heat into the atmosphere in a plume visible from half a mile. This wisp of vapor had already given everything it had to give before it left the ground. He understood it in that moment, not completely, not in the way he would understand it later, sitting warm with a bowl of stew in his hands and listening to a 16-year-old girl explain the architecture of what she had built. But enough. Enough to know what the wisp meant, which was that the heat was going somewhere other than the sky, and that somewhere was the hill itself, and that the hill was what was keeping the interior warm, and that he had been measuring the wrong thing when he had stood at the edge of her excavation in September and seen a hole in the ground rather than a dwelling. He found the door buried in drift up to his chest and beat on it with both fists because his hands were not reliable enough for a proper knock. He heard his own voice come out raw and uneven, saying something, her name probably, and the word for help, though he was not certain he needed help in the way people usually meant when they said that word. What he needed was harder to name than help. The door opened. The warmth did not rush out the way warmth rushes from a heated building into cold air. It came out the way warmth comes from the ground in early spring, gentle and total, and somehow unconditional, as though it had not been manufactured, but had simply always been there, waiting to be accessed. The light from the lamp was yellow and steady and did not flicker because there was no draft to make it flicker. And standing in it was Eliza Calloway, 16 years old, wearing a wool dress with no coat, no shawl, no extra layer of any kind. She looked at him with an expression that contained no triumph in it whatsoever. He had been prepared for some variant of triumph, had been steeling himself against it on the entire journey, and the absence of it caught him more completely off guard than the warmth had. "Come inside," she said. "Close the door behind you." He did both. The room was small and curved slightly where the hillside pressed against the plastered back wall, and the ceiling was low enough that he had to angle his head slightly near the entrance, and the floor was flat stone, fitted without mortar, and none of this was what held his attention. What held his attention was the wall. He had been a builder for 30 years. He knew walls the way musicians know instruments by the quality of response they gave back when you engaged them. He had laid hands on thousands of walls testing for plumb and for density and for the particular way cold transferred through a surface, which was never absent, only more or less present, even in the best insulated structures he had ever built. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his palm flat against the back wall. The wall was warm. Not warm in the relative sense, not merely less cold than the air outside. Warm in the absolute sense, warm the way the ground is warm on a July afternoon when you press your hand into the soil below the surface. A living warmth that came not from anything burning nearby, but from the accumulated patience of the earth that constituted the wall itself. It radiated against his palms steadily, and without variation, the same temperature at every point he tested top and bottom and center, as though the wall were a single continuous body rather than a structure. He stood there for a long time with his hand against the wall and said nothing. The shaking that had been cold began to change into a different kind of shaking, and he turned away from the wall because he was Edmund Hartwell and he was not going to let a 16-year-old girl see what was happening to his face. Eliza had moved to the stove and was ladling something from the pot into a bowl. She set the bowl on the small table and said, "Sit down, eat." He sat. He picked up the bowl. The stew was rabbit-flavored with dried herbs he could not identify, and it was the best thing he had eaten in months, not because of its quality, but because of where he was eating it. He ate half the bowl before he trusted himself to speak. "How?" The word came out smaller than he intended. She sat down across from him and looked at him in the steady lamplight. And what he saw in her face was not the face of someone who had won an argument. It was the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down. She told him about Thomas Calloway. Not the technical explanation, not the principles, not the architecture of the flue. She told him about a man who had worked underground for 30 years in South Wales because he understood the earth in a way that the surface world did not ask him to understand it. A man who had loved the stone and the dark and the slow thermal breath of deep places the way other men loved open sky. She told him about the journal that her mother had read aloud on cold evenings as though it were a collection of stories rather than a technical document, and about the way she had grown up hearing her grandfather's voice in sentences written by a man who died 6 years before she was born. She told him about the folded paper in the back of the journal, the drawing of a hillside with a door and a thin wisp of something that could only be smoke, the two Welsh words beneath it, Diner Cartref, this is the home. He drew it before I existed. She said he never built it. He ran out of time. She looked at the wall, then back at Edmund. I did not learn from him. I finished something he could not. Edmund was quiet for a moment. My father taught me to build, he said. It came out carefully, the way you say things you have not said before and are not entirely sure how to form. He was a carpenter in Pennsylvania. Not elaborate work, practical work, furniture and frames and barn construction. He taught me that wood was honest if you were honest with it, that it would tell you where it was weak if you listened. He paused. He died before I built my first house. He never saw what I made from what he gave me. Eliza said nothing. She waited. I have been angry, Edmund said, at what you built. Not because I thought you were wrong, though I did think you were wrong, because you did something with an inheritance that I do not think I have done with mine. He looked at his hands on the table, carpenter's hands, the knuckles prominent and the palms calloused in specific places from specific tools. Your grandfather gave you a principle. You built the thing the principle describes. I have spent 30 years building the same house in different configurations. The houses stand, Eliza said. They do. He looked up. They were cold. He told her about his youngest child. The cough that had become something more serious, the way his wife sat with the child near the fire, and the fire was never quite enough. The woodpile he had been watching diminish with the attention of a man watching a resource he cannot replace. He did not ask her for anything while he was telling it. He told it as a fact rather than a request. Eliza stood up. She went to the woodpile she had stacked along the interior wall, the carefully counted and rationed store that she had been managing with the precision of someone who knows the exact distance between enough and not enough. She looked at it for a moment with an expression he could not read. Then she began pulling pieces free and stacking them near the door. I cannot take your wood, Edmund said. You are not taking it. She kept stacking. I am giving it. There is a difference. Your own supply. She turned and looked at him directly. Your children did not choose any of this, Mr. Hartwell. They did not choose to live in a cabin that loses heat faster than the fire can produce it. They did not choose their father's certainty about what a house should be. A pause not unkind. The children are not the argument. They are just cold. He stood up and went to help her. They worked in silence for several minutes, building a stack near the door that was, he calculated, close to half of what remained of her supply. The mathematics of what she was doing were not lost on him. He understood exactly what the cost was, and he understood that she understood it and that she was making the calculation deliberately and had already accepted the result. When I stood at your excavation in September, he said, his voice quieter than before, I told you that you would die in this hole. Yes. I said it to the settlement as well, before I came out here, repeatedly. He set another piece of wood on the stack. I said it with confidence I had not earned. You said what you believed, Eliza said. That is not absolution. I know. She looked at him. But there is a difference between a man who lies and a man who is wrong. You were wrong. I was also wrong about several things before Agnes Prentice corrected me and before I rebuilt 3 days of work to fix the error. She picked up the last piece she was going to give him. Being correctable is not the same as being weak. Edmund Hartwell stood in the warm interior of the dugout that he had publicly called a grave and felt something shift in the architecture of himself, some load-bearing element that had been in the wrong position for a long time, settling into a configuration that was structurally sounder, if less familiar. They loaded the wood onto the drag sled he had brought without quite admitting to himself that he had expected to find something worth carrying back. She also gave him 2 heated stones wrapped in old cloth, dense creek stones she had warmed near the stove. For the children, she said, under the blankets against the feet. Before he went out into the storm again, he stopped at the door. When the weather breaks, he said, I will come back, not to inspect or advise. He held her gaze. I would like to learn what you know, if you are willing to teach it. Eliza considered this for a moment that was not entirely without its own quiet satisfaction. I have been willing since September, she said. He nodded once, pulled his muffler up, and went out into the dark. She listened to the storm close around the sound of the sled moving north, and then there was only the wind and the small, steady voice of the stove, and she sat down at the table and looked at her reduced wood pile, and did the calculations again with the new numbers, and the margin was thinner than she liked. But it was still a margin, and she had learned over the previous 5 months that a margin, however narrow, was the only thing between a situation and a catastrophe, and a narrow margin honestly counted was worth more than a comfortable one built on false arithmetic. The winter of 1883 broke in the second week of March. It did not break gently. It broke the way a fever breaks all at once, and then not the temperature rising 10 degrees in a single afternoon, and the snow softening from the surface down, and the creek running again in the night, with a sound that woke Eliza from sleep, because she had not heard moving water in 2 months, and the sound was stranger and more welcome than she had words for. Providence emerged into the thaw the way a person emerges from a long illness, cautiously taking inventory. There were losses. Not as many as there might have been, but enough that the spring had a particular quality of sobriety to it, a communal reckoning with the distance between what had been prepared and what the winter had actually required. Edmund Hartwell came to the hill on the first clear day as he had said he would. He brought his tools and his 2 sons and Daniel, who carried his notebook with the diagrams he had been revising all winter, and he brought also a quality of attention that Eliza had never seen from him before, a particular stillness and receptivity that was the expression of a man who has set down a thing he was carrying for a long time and found that his hands were free to hold something new. They were going to build for the Holt family first. William and Martha Holt had lost most of their root cellar stock to frost penetration when the foundation of their cabin cracked in January, and they were starting the spring with less than they needed and a structure they no longer trusted. Edmund and Eliza stood together at the south-facing slope the Holts had identified and walked it in the early morning light, and Eliza showed him what she looked at when she was reading a hillside, the angle of the sun's path, the drainage patterns, the way the grass grew differently where the soil composition changed. He listened with the quality of attention he had previously reserved only for wood. When she described the depth relationship between the living space and the channel exit, he asked a question she had not been asked before about the optimal distance between the stove position and the channel mouth in relation to the interior volume, and she thought about it carefully and said she did not know exactly, that her own placement had been intuitive, based on the journal's diagram rather than calculated, and he said that they should test 2 configurations and compare the results over the first winter. She looked at him for a moment. "That is a good idea," she said. He nodded without satisfaction, the nod of a craftsman receiving useful information rather than a compliment. She recognized the expression because it was probably the same expression she wore when Agnes had told her about the channel diameter, and she had understood that the correction would cost her 3 days, but would save the entire system. They broke ground that afternoon. The conflict, when it came, arrived on the second day. Edmund wanted to install internal wooden support posts along the roofline, a series of vertical columns to distribute the load of the earthen roof against the sidewalls. His instinct about roofs developed over 30 years of building structures that had to survive prairie weather told him that an earthen roof of the thickness Eliza specified, saturated by spring snowmelt, would generate more downward force than the sidewalls could bear without intermediate support. Eliza understood his reasoning and disagreed with it. Wooden posts set into an earthen floor would wick moisture from the ground, she told him. The wood would expand and contract with seasonal temperature changes at a different rate than the surrounding earth, creating movement at precisely the points where rigidity was most needed. Over 3 or 4 winters, the post would work loose, and a loose post in a load-bearing position was worse than no post at all. Edmund listened to this with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his thinking expression, the slight inward focus that meant he was pressure testing an argument rather than resisting it. "Then what carries the load?" he said. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. "The sod roof does if the courses are laid correctly," she said. "The arch of the earth transfers the load laterally into the hillside. The sidewalls are not bearing the vertical load the hillside is. The posts would interrupt that transfer without providing equivalent support." He was quiet for a longer moment. His 2 sons were watching. Daniel was writing in his notebook. "If we wrap the posts in clay," Edmund said, "packed tight, sealed at the base with the same mortar mixture as the walls, we eliminate the moisture wicking. We match the thermal movement closely enough that the differential expansion becomes negligible." Eliza thought about this. She thought about it for long enough that Edmund did not interrupt her, because he had learned in 40 years of working with other craftsmen that the pause before an answer was where the quality of the answer lived. "Yes," she said, "that works." Daniel wrote it down without comment, but when he looked up from the notebook, There was something in his expression that neither of them acknowledged directly, the particular expression of someone watching two people think together for the first time and recognizing that the result is better than either of them would have reached alone. They used clay-wrapped posts. Eliza directed the thermal architecture, the orientation, the channel, the wall depths, the roof composition. Edmund directed the structural framing, the entry support, the interior organization that made the space livable for a family of four rather than a solitary 16-year-old girl. The house they built together was not simply Eliza's design improved. It was something that neither of them would have built independently, a structure that combined the thermal intelligence of the Callaway method with the structural sophistication of 30 years of practical building experience, and the combination produced something that was genuinely greater than either of its constituent intelligences. They called it the Providence Dugout, though the name came from the community rather than from either of its builders, who both found names less interesting than results. Agnes Prentice came on the fourth day. She arrived without announcement, as she had at Eliza's Hill in October, and she stood at the edge of the construction for a time watching. She said nothing for a long period. Edmund's sons had learned by this point not to expect conventional social behavior from Agnes Prentice and went on working without acknowledging her presence. Finally, she set down the basket she had been carrying, a covered basket that turned out to contain cornbread and a jar of preserved plums and a quantity of dried venison, and she said to no one in particular, "Men doing real work need food at midday." Then she turned and walked back toward Providence without waiting for a response. Eliza watched her go and felt something she could not immediately name, a warmth that was not the warmth of the earth or the warmth of the stove, but the warmth of a person showing you something true about themselves through an action so small it could only be sincere. On the last day of construction, when the Holt house was sealed and ready, Eliza stood inside it alone for a few minutes before she called the others to come and look. She stood in the center of the floor with her hand against the back wall, which was not yet warm because the house had not yet been fired, and she waited for the stillness of the interior to settle around her. The house smelled of fresh earth and cut grass and the specific mineral quality of the flagstone floor. It smelled the way her own house had smelled on the first evening she spent in it before the fire had run and the thermal charge had begun to build and the walls had found their warmth. It smelled like a beginning. She thought about William and Martha Holt spending their first winter in this house, and about the children they would have eventually, and about those children growing up, understanding as simply and completely as they understood anything that the earth beneath their feet was not something to be fought or excluded or built against, but something to be partnered with, to be understood on its own terms, which were slow and patient and entirely reliable if you were slow and patient enough to learn them. She thought about Thomas Callaway, who had known all of this and had drawn a picture of it in a folded piece of paper and put it in the back of a journal that had crossed an ocean and a continent and arrived eventually in the hands of the person who would build the thing he had imagined. She placed her palm flat against the wall one more time. It was cool now. It would not stay cool. When the Holt family moved in 3 weeks later, on a mild April afternoon with the first real warmth of the year in the air, Martha Holt touched the same wall and turned to Eliza with an expression that Eliza recognized because she had worn it herself, the expression of someone feeling something that does not match what they were told to expect. "It is already starting to warm," Martha said, "and we have not lit the stove yet." "That is the earth," Eliza said. "It has been warming since February. We just gave it a room to put the warmth in." By the end of that first summer, 4 Providence dugout structures had been built on the south-facing slopes around the settlement. By the following autumn, the number had doubled. Edmund Hartwell built 3 of them himself, and on each one he brought a question to Eliza that she either answered or thought through with him until they arrived at an answer together, and on each one Daniel added pages to the notebook that had begun as a set of diagrams drawn from memory on a cold November night. Thomas Greer, the young carpenter, who had dismissed Eliza at the community meeting with the word lucky, came to Edmund in July and asked to be shown the construction method. Edmund told him to ask Eliza. Greer stood in the doorway of her dugout the following afternoon with his hat in his hands, in a quality of reluctance that she could see required real effort to overcome, and she invited him in and showed him the journal diagrams and answered his questions without mentioning the word lucky or anything adjacent to it. He left 3 hours later with a page of notes and the expression of a man who has had something confirmed that he had been trying not to believe. She taught him what she knew. That was all. Clara Voss came in June running the full 2 miles from Providence on a morning when the grass was wet and the hills were the deep green of early summer, arriving breathless at the door of the dugout with her dark hair loose and her boots soaked through. She was 8 years old and she had asked her father for permission, and Roland, who had said, "Not your concern," on every previous occasion, had stood in the kitchen for a long moment and then said simply, "Do not come home late," which Clara understood to be the closest thing to a blessing that Roland Voss was capable of offering. Eliza met her at the door and took her through the whole house room by room, explaining each element in language scaled to an 8-year-old without diminishing the substance of what she was explaining, because she had found that children were almost always more capable of receiving complexity than adults assumed, provided you trusted them with the real version rather than a simplified one. Clara asked 7 questions, 5 of which were perceptive enough that Eliza had to take a moment to formulate an answer, and 2 of which she could not fully answer at all, and she told Clara so honestly. "I do not know yet," she said. "I am still learning." Clara seemed to find this more interesting than a complete answer would have been. She came back the following week and the week after that. By August, she had developed a habit of sitting at the small table with one of the books from the trunk and reading quietly while Eliza worked, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of people who understand each other without requiring continuous explanation. It was not the sisterhood that Roland had prevented and could not quite prevent now that his refusal had become logistically impossible. It was something that did not have a name already assigned to it, something built from small, accumulated presences, the way the thermal mass of the hill was built from small, accumulated degrees of warmth, patient, inconsistent, and ultimately formidable. In the evenings that summer, when the work was done and the light was long, and the prairie ran gold to the horizon, Eliza would sometimes sit in the entrance of the dugout with the journal in her lap and read the same passages she had been reading since she was small enough that her mother had to hold the book. They meant different things now than they had meant then, and different things than they had meant in the cold, desperate focus of the autumn, and she expected they would continue to mean different things as the years accumulated, and she brought to them an experience she did not yet have. On a particular evening in late August, she turned to the final page and read the last sentence one more time. "The fire is a noisy guest, but the heat is a loyal friend. Learn which one to invite into your walls." She had been turning this over for a year now, the way you turn a stone in a current, wearing it smooth by continued handling. She had understood it first as instruction, then as comfort, then as the specific grief of a thing said by someone you will never meet. What she understood now, sitting in the entrance of the house she had built with her own hands from an idea that had traveled 30 years and an ocean to reach her, was something she had not been old enough to understand before. Thomas had not been writing about houses. He had been writing about people. The fire was a noisy guest because noise and heat are not the same thing, because the performance of warmth and warmth itself are entirely different quantities, because a person can fill a room with the evidence of their presence without leaving anything of lasting value in the walls. The loyal heat was what remained after the noise was gone, the warmth that had been deposited quietly into the substance of the people around you, invisible and constant, and only recognized fully when the cold came and the fire was out, and you discovered that the walls themselves were warm. Her grandfather had been writing about the difference between a person who occupies a life and a person who charges it. She looked out at the prairie going gold in the evening light and thought about all the people who had been in the walls of her life. Her mother reading a dead man's words aloud as though they were fairy tales, depositing warmth into her daughter through 30 years of accumulated evenings she would never remember individually. Agnes Prentice offering the inside diameter of a brick kiln flue as impersonally as weather, and saving Eliza's winter with a correction that took 40 seconds to deliver. Daniel standing in a storm with a notebook full of diagrams he had drawn from memory because the truth of a thing was important enough to understand fully rather than superficially. Edmund placing his palm against a warm wall with an expression that was the beginning of something rather than the end of anything. Clara pressing her hand to a cold window. Eliza turned to the back of the final page and picked up the stub of pencil she kept inside the cover. She wrote below her grandfather's last sentence in her own hand, smaller and neater than his had been. "Grandfather, I built it. I will pass it on." She closed the journal and sat in the last of the evening light, and the hill behind her was warm, and the warmth was not from the fire she had built that morning, but from every day of the long summer and the summer before it and the summer before that, stored in the patient dark earth and released now gently and without fanfare into the night.